Hello, in today's step-by-step walkthrough video, I will be using Jamovi version 2.6.44 to perform, interpret, and write up an independent samples t-test. I recommend downloading today's dataset before we begin. You can also access this resource in the Psychology Resource Library. Here we have our dataset within Jamovi. We have two variables, senior course, which is a nominal variable, and critical thinking skills, which is a continuous or a scale variable. In this example, we're interested in seeing whether the critical thinking skills differs between high school seniors who are in an Australian National Curriculum senior program relative to those in an International Baccalaureate senior program. In other words, we have an independent variable, senior course, with two levels, Australian National Curriculum and International Baccalaureate, and our dependent variable is critical thinking skills. This was a test that students took, and these values represent scores on this test. Prior to running our independent samples t-test, we need to assess normality. We do this by going to Exploration, Descriptives. We then move our dependent variable into the variables box and senior course into the split by box. In other words, we are separately assessing the normality assumption for critical thinking skills at each level of our IV. Within statistics, we additionally select skewness, kurtosis, and Shapiro-Wilk, and we can see our output coming up automatically there in the right-hand window. We can then run our independent samples t-test by going to t-tests, independent samples t-test. We move critical thinking skills into dependent variables and senior course into grouping variable. Ensure that students has been selected. We can leave hypothesis at the default setting of a non-directional hypothesis. We also select mean difference, and that confidence interval is set to 95%, effect size, descriptives, and we also assess homogeneity of variance, which is another assumption that we need to check prior to interpreting our analysis. So to check our normality assumption, we look at our descriptives table. We're looking at the Shapiro-Wilk p-value or significance value for both of our groups. Here we can see that both of these values are above the 0.05 threshold. In other words, they are both non-significant, and this means that our assumption of normality has been met for both of these groups. Another way of thinking about this is that they do not significantly deviate from normality. We then look at our next assumption, which is homogeneity of variance. Here we look at the p-value and we can see that it is above the 0.05 threshold. Thus we have also met this assumption and can proceed with interpreting our t-test. If we look here at our group statistics, we can see that those in the International Baccalaureate program scored higher on the critical thinking skills test than those in the Australian National Curriculum. However, to see if there's a significant difference in critical thinking skills between these groups, we look at our independent samples t-test table. We look at the p-value. We can see that this is below the 0.05 threshold. In other words, there is a significant difference between these groups, and more specifically, those in the International Baccalaureate program scored significantly higher on the critical thinking skills test than those in the Australian National Curriculum. On average, this difference was 8.75 points on the critical thinking skills test. The 95% confidence interval tells us that we can be 95% confident that the true population mean difference lies between negative 15.77 and negative 1.73. The write-up for this example could look as follows. 40 recent high school graduates completed a critical thinking skills test. 20 of whom had completed the International Baccalaureate Senior Program, while the remaining 20 had completed the Standard Australian National Curriculum Senior Program. An independent samples t-test determined that the International Baccalaureate students scored significantly higher on the critical thinking skills test than the Australian National Curriculum students. The Cohen's d indicated this can be considered a large effect. Then locating the values that we incorporated into that write-up, we've included the sample size for each of the two groups. We have the mean and standard deviation values for our two groups. We have the degrees of freedom, as well as the t-statistic, the p-value or significance value. Also included the mean difference, and the lower and upper confidence interval values, as well as the effect size, noting that that sign does not need to be included in your write-up. You can access the full suite of resources in the Psychology Resource Library. Follow our YouTube channel for more walkthrough videos like this one.